Intimacies and Inequalities from Singapore. And we will have approximately 1 hour lecture that will be followed by 30 minutes of discussion. I personally would like to appreciate Professor Quah Ee Ling for her time and for this lecture. And I think we can start with the lecture as soon as she is ready for it.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen now. Are you able to see the slides, and can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you. Thanks. So hi, everyone. I'm Quah Ee Ling. My surname is Quah, and given name is Ee Ling. The correct order of my name is surname first, followed by my given name. My pronoun is she, her. I'm a fire dragon feminist. I'm on a mission to fill up my fire dragon feminist arsenal with superpowers, and I'm on a mission to collect more superpowers and use the superpowers to expose inequalities, blow flames at injustices, rebuild communities for a more just and equal society. I have very little patience for misogyny, for patriarchy, racism, and queerphobia, and white mediocrity as well. I'm Singaporean of Chinese, Hokkien, and Indonesian Peranakan heritage. I'm a queer migrant woman academic residing and working on never ceded land of indigenous people and nation in settler colonial Australian society. Now, whenever I present about divorce, I will get questions like, how do we prevent divorce? How can we lower our divorce rates? How can we protect marriages, families, and children, amongst other questions that reflect the deep-seated belief in the institution of marriage and family. To avoid disappointment, I thought I would first clarify that those are not the questions that my research addresses. I'm a feminist sociologist interested in understanding and exposing unequal power relations and broader structures of inequalities and injustices. So for this project on transnational divorce, I'm particularly interested in these research questions and hope you can have these questions in mind as I share my findings. So I'm interested in how wealthy countries are responsible for and complicit in generating and benefiting from global inequalities. I grew up and spent a lot of my adult life in Singapore, which is one of the wealthiest countries in Asia region, as well as Southeast Asia region, as well as in the world. So how are wealthy countries like Singapore, including the country that I live in now in Australia, responsible for and complicit in generating and benefiting from global inequalities? How do worsening global inequalities impact personal lives, private lives, transnational marriage, divorce, and intimacies? Why and how are some divorcees better resourced in navigating post-divorce challenges? Why and how do some divorcees keep hitting roadblocks in their divorce biographies? In my earlier conceptualization of divorce biography, I suggest understanding divorce as a biographical, non-linear, and non-standardized process. Now, the framework of divorce biography disrupts commonplace understanding that divorce is an once-off legal event, and divorcees who typically go through expected stages of recovery, as you can see in many self-help books. More importantly, it challenges the negative perception of this life event as if it's a death sentence and a lifelong tragedy to be avoided at all costs. So I'm sure you're familiar with the discourse that divorce is always really bad, and it's so bad, it's so tragic for children, for families. Not to discount that there are undesirable consequences as a result of divorce, but my research also shows how divorce often offer a second chance at life for the respondents I spoke with, including the children involved in these families. So in my first book, this is my first book, Perspectives on Marital Dissolution, Divorce Biographies in Singapore, I found four main elements. These four main elements that are evident in my respondents' live experiences and encounters. So one of the things that I found is that divorcees exercise autonomy and reflexivity to end their marriage and work out less trodden pathways. Of course, it requires a lot of individual choice and autonomy to say that I'm going to move away from that mainstream path that has been widely celebrated. But they do not construct their divorce biography in isolation. It's not just an individualistic decision, because often people think that, oh, divorcees are very selfish. They didn't think about the children. They didn't think about the families and society. But from my research, with a lot of divorce respondents, I found that they actually construct their divorce biography and make the decisions collaboratively with their support network of kin, friends, co-workers, and other significant people in their lives, including their children. What is particularly striking in my research subjects account is their narratives around the pursuit of productivity, where they feel that they don't want to stay divorced all their life. So the desire to reorientate their sense of self, to make necessary necessary adaptations and imagine new possibilities, and not to stay divorced and to move on to lead productive life is especially prominent in their narratives as they reflect upon their divorce experiences. It is important to note as well, there's not a single story. We always think that divorcees all go through the same kind of experiences, and we tend to generalize as well based on what we observe, in the media discourse and also in more conservative academic discourse. So it's important to note that there's no monolithic story of divorce, but multiple non-linear. So it's not moving in one direction, not getting better, but it could be up and down. It could be undulating. It could be moments of productivity, and lapse into moments of difficulties and challenges, and then moving up again. And it can happen simultaneously. So it's a very complex intersection of events, processes, context, and identity. So that was an earlier conceptualization of divorce biography, which I thought I should clarify in order to explain why this second book is a sequel to the first book, and why it is why the conceptual framework of a transnational divorce biography extends the first conceptual framework. So this second book extends the theoretical framework of divorce biography to conceptualize the transnational aspects of divorce experiences. It presents a theoretical framework which I call transnational divorce biography, and it's important to note that the theoretical work of this project, like the earlier study, it is a ground-up theoretical approach where the theorizations are derived from empirical findings collected on the ground through in-depth one-on-one interviews with my research subjects. So detailed narrative accounts collected through in-depth one-on-one interviews with 50 divorcees provide deep insights into the complexities and intricacies of transnational divorce practices. Essentially, the project is about developing a praxisgraphy that records, describes, decode, map out, and analyze familiar and intimacy practices innovated and enacted by transnational divorcees. And also the meanings that they attach to these practices and the practices imposed upon them at the intersection of events, processes, structures, and contexts they are located in. And in this second book, I found again another four main emergent themes from the data that I collected through the interviews with my research subjects. So I will discuss how these themes could be observed in 4 specific groups of participants of my study in this lecture. Now, after interviewing about 50 divorcees at a few sites of Singapore, I loosely grouped them into these 4 main groups. And I managed to find some common themes in the way that they construct their post-divorce intimacy practices, right? So this is how I structured the book. The first group that I looked at was the low-income divorced migrant women. I call their intimacy practices as constricted intimacy. So it's very restricted, it's very unpredictable, and often they feel that their hands are tied and they have very limited space to navigate their intimacy practices with their families and children. Another group is the low-income divorced citizen men. So these are the low-income divorced Singaporean citizen men, because I conducted all my field work at the site of at the field side of Singapore. And I call their intimacy practices instrumental intimacies. And then I have the middle class living apart together divorced parents, and I describe their intimacies as a form of privileged intimacies. And I also have a group of overseas-based divorced Singaporean mothers who are located overseas, but we did our interview through Zoom and Skype, where these are Singaporean citizen mothers who are divorced and they're located in other countries like the US, the UK, Australia, but they still remain in touch with their home country, particularly because their families and in some cases their children are still in Singapore. So they have this entanglements with their home country and with their families back home. So I call their intimacy practices entangled intimacy. So for the rest of the lecture, I will explain how these 4 groups of divorcees construct their transnational intimacies in different conditions and how it surface some of the themes that I talked about earlier on, right? And these are the 4 themes. So it will come out in some of the discussions. So these 4 themes include looking at how global neoliberal economy and global hierarchy of nations impact individual practices, and how they are located at the intersection of multiple systems of domination and oppression. And also you see this trans-border flow of intimacy and familiar resources, not just across actual physical geographical borders, but also across the normal borders of normative borders or the national borders of what it means to be a proper family. So just to bear in mind that when I talk about borders, it's not just the actual geographical borders that we often think about in terms of transnational families and transnational migration. But in this case, I also conceptualize it by looking at how they cross the borders of a proper national family, a heteronormative, heterosexual, legally married family with children. And one of the other themes that I look at is how it is never a stage where I will work towards where I arrive and I'm recovered, I'm well again. But it is constantly this to and fro, which I talk about in my earlier conceptualization, that is not linear. And sometimes they are stuck in this liminality where it is full of uncertainty, it's almost in the burger tree, just waiting. But nevertheless, they did display resistance and hopes in very, very challenging situations. So these are the 4 themes that I found in their stories, and I will go through them one by one now. Now, I think that moving on to look at transnational aspects of divorce biography was really interesting because it's not just about the local or national context, but to look at the global context and how global political economy really plays such a huge impact on individual life choices around marriage and divorce, because we often think that marriage and divorce is something that's so private, we don't talk about it. But when you get into the field side to do this research, I soon found out that it's not an individual private decision at all. It is very much affected and impacted by what is happening in the global economy, right? Whether it is in terms of global hierarchy of nations, or whether it is in terms of global gender order or transnational patriarchy. There's so many global and transnational structures of inequalities at play here. So the first group that I was really interested to look at was that came out from my research was this low-income divorced marriage migrant women, something that's probably familiar in the South Korean context as well, where you have large group of low-income marriage migrant women who marry local Korean men, and so this is not it's not unique to Singapore. It's a global phenomenon, right? It's a global family phenomenon. So for me to talk about their divorce practices, I think that it is important that I would first need to provide the context of marriage migration. So what we have witnessed here is this growth of global capitalist neoliberal economy. And one of the outcome of this growth of global neoliberal economy is the dramatic expansion of low-wage feminized work. So the feminization of labor and poverty is really stuck, one of the prominent elements of or the result of the expansion of global neoliberal economy. So migrant women from poor socio-economic background and less wealthy countries or lower ranked countries are mobilized in large numbers across the globe, right? So this is a global phenomenon to supply productive and domestic labor to men and families from wealthier countries. When I talk about reproductive labor, I'm referring to activities conducted to achieve the reproduction of human beings intra and intergenerationally. Such labor could be paid and unpaid. Now, so often when we talk about reproductive labor or domestic labor, we think about the paid labor, for example, domestic helpers, right? Healthcare workers, nannies, right? Nannies, cleaners, sex workers, they all carry out paid reproductive labor in private households and in institutional settings. But what has often not been thought of is the unpaid labor performed by the marriage migrants in their roles as wives, mothers, and daughter-in-laws. They're unpaid, but they are all mobilized in large numbers across the globe to provide reproductive labor. And that is essential to the reproduction of economies in these wealthy countries, the receiving countries, including like Singapore and many other countries, the wealthier countries like even Australia, right? That they are benefiting from this unpaid reproductive labor that often there's not enough acknowledgement and recognition because they are seen as a wife and they come as, you know, on a partner visa, but they are mobilized in large numbers across the globe. So for many poor women from less wealthy countries, going on the route of marriage migration seems to be the only viable way they know how to lift themselves and their families out of poverty, right? So in their own local geographical situations, their own political economic situations, where it is not something that we can, many of us can imagine when you grow up, your only choice is to go on a marriage migration or to go on any other kind of migration routes in order to lift yourself out of poverty. So some of us who are more privileged, when we are growing up, we think that, oh, you know, my dream job is to be a doctor, is to be a lawyer, is to be a teacher, is to be an academic. But many poor women from less wealthy countries, it is not. They don't have the luxury of choice, where they feel that they know that the only way to lift themselves out of and their families out of poverty and to gain some mobility is to go through the marriage migration route. So based on the new logic behind this specific marriage migration trend, poor women brought in to supply reproductive labor are expected to perform their labor in exchange for financial support, in exchange for some form of security in terms of visa. Right? So some of these marriage migration women find themselves with very little bargaining power right from the start because they have been caught in a transaction. It's a transactional marriage where where the other party will pay a sum of money as part of the introduction fee or marriage broker fee or to my family, and then I'm expected to go over to provide reproductive labor. So right from the start, the power dynamics is already unequal, right? So this is important for us to remember. And because of the unequal power dynamics that started the marriage, the transactional marriage, it stayed throughout the marriage in most cases, the cases I spoke with. And then you see it being unfolded in the divorce, right? Even after divorce, when they're negotiating for different kinds of arrangements. So what happened is that when they move over to their host countries, they're constantly being evaluated by their citizen husband and in-laws in the way they perform domestic chores, elder care, reproduction and caring for children, marital sex, and other intimacy practices. They face possible ejection and disposal by the family should they fail to fulfill their side of the contractual transactional marriage. When divorce takes place, non-resident divorced mothers face the imminent possibility of being sent back to their home country and separated from their Singaporean citizen children. Once they exit the marriage that legitimizes their entry and stay in the first place, they face another round of disposal by their host country when their citizen spouse decides to withdraw sponsorship of their visa at the point of divorce, and their visas get cancelled. So even if that does not happen, they may still not be able to stay on because when their existing visa expires, they will not be granted an extension since they have already moved out of that heteronormative marriage framework that give them the legitimacy to stay in the first place. right? So that's just to give you some really important context there when we talk about this low-income divorced marriage migrant. So with this group of women, to make sense of their experience in terms of migration, marriage, and divorce, I use the framework of violence to understand the women's experiences. Using a transnational and intersectional feminist lens, my research is concerned with how the distribution of resources and life chances works under the influence of unequal and uneven effects of globalization and the intersection of multiple shifting interconnected systems of oppression, right? So as we know that in the global context, because of the hierarchy of countries, because of how, because of the political economy, because of the dynamics, the power dynamics between countries, we know that our destinies or our life journeys are very different, right, from countries to countries. And therefore, it is important for us to note that not every country benefit from globalization, and there have been unequal effects of globalization, and that really affect the distribution of life chances, meaning that not everybody get to live, right? And there's a hierarchy of human lives. As we can see now with COVID, it's so clear, right? There is even a map now to show the global the global context of unequal distribution of vaccine, which also means the unequal distribution of life chances. Not everybody get to live, right? So in this case, particular events and processes such as globalization, the immigration regime within each country, and even national population control produce different outcomes for different people, depending on their location within specific contexts and the interaction and relationship with their physical, economic, and social environments. So when we think about violence, we often think that of physical violence, right? For example, the infliction of pain that in various scenarios like war, genocides, mass shooting, hate crimes, tortures, sexual assault, and domestic violence. Now, the project approaches the notion of violence beyond the infliction of physical harm. Nevertheless, it's harmful, right? It's just that we sometimes don't see it because it's not physical, right? It's not physically observed. But I look at violence in two ways. One is this disposability, you're being disposed, thrown away, and depletion, right? Where your life is being debilitated, being weakened minute by minute to the point that it is hard to live. But it's not possible to die. So you're being kept alive, but you can't live properly. So that is also a form of violence, right? So in particular, I consider the manifestation of violence through the expulsion of bodies, disposability of ties, so the relationships, right? Debilitation of lives, non-consensual disruption of relationships, and deprivation of access to resources. These elements all contribute into that framework of violence that other scholars have talked about. So in the context of migration and citizenship, some bodies with the desired combination of criteria, for example, if you belong to the correct class, right, or the correct gender, a correct sexuality, correct race, correct country of origin, you are easily co-opted. In fact, people will welcome you, even could also possibly send you letters to invite you to become the permanent residents, where you get visas easily, or they would welcome you to become a citizen even. So you're easily co-opted into and embraced by the host society. But on the other hand, some bodies encountering intersection of multiple systems of oppression, such as global hierarchy of citizenship, xenophobia, heteronormativity, and patriarchy, they are more vulnerable to ejection and disposability, right? So when the whole society feel that you are of no value to us, why do we keep you? We can eject you easily. But if you belong to the right class, right gender, right country, then you know that the treatment is very different, as we all know, right? When we think about migration. So some people, you know, that they get their PR so easily or their citizenship so easily, but some have to travel by the boat and then being locked up in detention facility for years and never know when they will get out of that jail, right? So this is why it is important when we think about marriage migration and how they're being treated, how these low-income women are being treated. So some of these things that we should bear in mind is that when we think about transnational divorce or transnational marriage, it's never just about individual choices, or it's not just about romance and about love, but it is really a reflection of the global political economy, and it's also a reflection of the hierarchy of value of human lives. And it can be even more prominent now in COVID times, where we really see the hierarchy of value of human life. Some people are able to get booster shots, they're able to, get it really quickly, and some people just do not even have the ability to get any form of medical help. So to understand the disposability and debilitation of bodies in improper categories, such as the disadvantaged class, the low income, the working class, or the underclass, or people who who do not belong to the gender binary, or people who do not belong to the heterosexual group, or the highly ranked countries, or the white race, I find Dean Spade conceptualization of administrative violence really, really helpful. He explains administrative violence in the context of North American society as being a settler colony, where bodies are being arranged into categories such as country of origin, gender, race, sexuality, and ability. And these administrative systems, including legislation, the law system, the bureaucracy, and the policies, all work to define citizenship parameters. So often we think that this categorization system is a very neutral, official way. You didn't think that it could be racist, it could be xenophobic, it could be sexist, but in fact they are, because it is the way they decide to categorize human beings, sort them into categories, and then add value to it. So already it is a hierarchy of value of human lives. And those who are in proper categories, of course, they have greater access to resources, right? They have and therefore they have greater access to better life chances, better life outcomes. So this is how the distribution of privileges and distribution of inequality takes place. So the low-income divorced marriage migrant women in my study experience these manifestations of violence in two specific areas. One is in the public domain, when they are interacting with the administrative system, when they're trying to negotiate their visa, when they're trying to have access to medical support, when they're trying to interact with employment, right? Trying to get employment, trying to get work. They also experience that violence in the intimate sphere of family and marriage, right? So this is how I use that theorization of violence to make sense of the experience. So to give you one example is Chow, a Vietnamese migrant mother in her 20s with a young child, right? So Chow, right, when Chow moved from Vietnam to Singapore, so she was initially really isolated because she couldn't have access to work, and she was caught up she was stuck at home, where she started to have to live with a new family, and there was language and cultural barriers, and also as you know from the beginning, it is a transactional marriage, so the power dynamics was already very unequal. So she was seen as somebody to supply reproductive labor, right? So she was seen to be a good wife, so you have to have sex with your husband. You must be seen as somebody who is willing to give birth to children, and then when the children are born, you're supposed to be the carer, right? You're supposed to look after your children, and there are also in-laws living with her, so she's also supposed to provide elder care, and she's in charge of all the domestic labor within the house. So effectively, she was going in as like an unpaid maid, right? Unpaid domestic helper, but no one will naturally see marriage migrant women as doing unpaid reproductive labor. But that is what's happening in this case, right? So she is just one of the many low-income marriage migrant women that have been mobilized across the globe to supply reproductive labor to families in wealthy countries. So, but there's constant pressure of being evaluated whether you are good enough, because from the perspective of the citizen husband and the family, they will think that since we paid for you, you are supposed to produce all this labor, and there's a constant evaluation. Now, when I share these stories, of course, these are the stories that didn't work out. So it doesn't mean that there are no happy endings, where stories where there are marriages that are successful. But it is not just about the individual cases. I think what is important as sociologists is to really see the global context and the national, transnational context, and how those kind of inequalities get mapped out in intimate lives, and how it affects the dynamics between couples, and how it affects their divorce outcomes. So some women like Chow, right, face disposal at the side of family when their when their Singaporean spouse and the in-law decide that the foreign wife has not met their expectations in carrying out her reproductive and domestic responsibility. So in this case, for Chow, she finally got permission to work outside of the house, managed to get a job so that she can have interaction. She was very happy. But the family still expect her to come back and fulfill your domestic labor at home, But so one day when she came home and she was late, this happened, right? She was being chased out together with a mother that she has asked her mother to come over from Vietnam to help her look after the child so that she can go out to work, because nobody, not her husband and not her in-laws, are willing to look after the child. So they were thrown out in the middle of the night, and they were being threatened with physical violence if they don't leave the house. So she has no choice. So Chow was disposed, thrown away, discarded like a rag doll when her host family deemed her as not having performed the duties that she's expected to when she came back late from work. So Chow in the end fought for divorce, but the violence, the form of violence being disposed, right, the administrative violence did not stop when her ex-husband exercised his citizenship and patriarchal privileges and intimidated her into giving up custody of a child. And we, as a foreign woman, right, and knowing that your visa is dependent on the sponsorship of your husband, you are naturally afraid, right? You have very little bargaining power. And so she thought that the system would not be on her side. And so she gave up the custody of a child. And when her visa expired, she had to leave Singapore. So that was a very violent disruption of non-consensual relationship between her and the child. So this is what I mean by using the framework of violence, that it is very, very violating for her to have to go and be forcibly separated from her young child. So she was not only disposed by her host family, but also by her host society, Singapore society in this case, because when she was initially co-opted into the institution of heteronormative marriage, she was expected to have reproductive potential, right, to help to reproduce and to keep the population going for Singapore. So once she was being discarded out of the heteronormative marriage framework, she's no longer intelligible to the system. The system feel that, so why are you here when you're not in this marriage framework anymore? And therefore, when the visa come to an end, you don't qualify for work visa or anything, because you were supposed to come and produce certain form of labor, and you're supposed to fill up a role. And so based on this neoliberal logic, retaining these women in the host country would then drain resources reserved for citizens and add strain to the economy. Often that is the rhetoric, right, about how we treat migrants. So the women then went through another round of categorization, another round of sorting, to be categorized as bodies with no productive potential, and therefore should be disposed. And so she was disposed. Of course, it was not spelled out this way in an explicit way, but as we analyze, you will see that the disposal did happen. She was being chucked out, and it could take place very easily through the neutral, seemingly objective administrative mechanism of disapproving the visa extension or visa renewal, or just basically limit her eligibility and say that you're not eligible anymore to apply for visa renewal because there's no local citizen sponsorship. So you can wholly use some of these bureaucratic procedures to justify why there's no visa renewal. But from how we analyze as scholars, we'll know that these are all administrative mechanisms to enact violence, right, on bodies that they feel that they have been sorted into categories that are not proper or not useful or do not have any productive potential. Now, but back in Vietnam, Chow didn't give up her child. So she thought that I'm not going to give up my child. I'm still trying to come back and see her. But for her, then her only way to get back to Singapore, again, she had no choice but to go on the marriage migration route again, in order to gain mobility back into, and her entry back into Singapore. So she has to then get onto the marriage migration route again and marry another Singaporean man in order to get back, right? But it's not because that she thinks that, she was hoping for happiness through the marriage, which was the original intent. But the second marriage was more because that there's no other solution for her. The only only way is to go through remarriage and to be able to get back and see her child again and hopefully have a chance at reclaiming child custody. So the working of heteronormativity here is very, very stark, is evidence, right? Where she could only make her migrant identity intelligible to the host country by fitting herself within the national framework of heteronormative marriage in order to gain re-entry, right? So the categorization already reflects, certain constraints and certain kind of values that each society has. So in this kind of challenging existence, right, this transnational divorce women's intimacy practices with their citizen children are often very constricted, very restricted. Of course, each story is quite different based on their circumstances, but as you can see how difficult it is to construct intimacy practices with their children, right? It's very constricted, and that's why I call it this way. I conceptualize the intimacy this way. Although we do know that in some of the stories, they do display resistance, resilience, and whatever you want to call it, they have hope. But the truth is that the context that they're located in works against them, right? There's just all these inequalities stack up against them that make their trajectories especially difficult, and that really reflects the unequal distribution of life chances. Now, another group of respondents that I came across in my research is this group of low-income divorced citizen men who went into the marriage market, the international or regional marriage market, to look for a foreign bride, right? So in this international marriage market, men from wealthier, more highly ranked countries like Singapore and South Korea, including, right, they are seen as the consumers who demand intimate labor and occupy the relatively privileged end of this commodification of intimacy, right? So intimacy, marriage are all being commodified as if it's a product that you can buy in the market. So I'm sure you have seen documentaries about how this man will go into the marriage broker and they look through a photo album to pick, right? So as if that they're in the market just choosing the products. Now, so often people just, sometimes there's also victim blaming. They think that, oh, it's the women, why do women want to do this? It's lucky that they have a chance and things like that. But we fail to see the global context that these women do not have a chance to go on the route and say that I will go to the university and one day I'll be an academic, I'll be a lawyer and doctor. That's a very limited employment pathway or life pathway for them. So we need to, as wealthy countries, we need to also reflect on our own responsibility here and complicity. How is it that, people in our countries are able to have access to such privileges, and why is it that countries, people in other countries constantly are at the bottom of this hierarchy of nations, and why is it that they constantly are disadvantaged from globalization? So not being able to have access, to have some success in the local marriage market due to their low-income categorization, these men, when they enter into the international marriage market or the regional marriage market, they are in fact deemed as having good market value, right? Because we also need to consider the regional hierarchy. So if you look at Singapore, in the Southeast Asia regional hierarchy, Singapore is ranked at the top. And then you have other countries around like Malaysia, Indonesia, Myanmar, Cambodia. They are ranked lower and they're less wealthy, right? So Singapore then become the destination country for marriage migration, because then it makes sense to go there and hopefully to seek a better life, right? And instead of thinking that, oh, these rich countries are actually doing the poor countries a favor, or they're being benevolent and very charitable. And that's often the discourse, including this man I spoke with. They say that, oh, we're actually helping these poor women. If we don't marry them, they will remain poor, Instead of thinking ourselves as benevolent, as charitable, I think that it is also important for us to think about why is it that these rich countries can continue to benefit from globalization, and why is it some countries remains at the bottom of this process. So in this case, this low-income men that they don't have much value in the local marriage market. They went into the international marriage market to search for a wife. What they are also trying to do is to engage in their masculinity projects, right? So they are also, they're not, I'm not trying to put create an image of like evil versus good, you know, or evil versus the vulnerable. That's not the case. Now these men are also trapped in their own, also fell victim into their own masculinity project. And I'm sure you will understand this as well, that the Asian masculinity projects are very prominent. I mean, you have the global masculinity projects where you look at the hegemonic masculinity. If you look at Mark Zuckerberg, you look at you know, Bill Gates. These are the people who are the rich, right? The ultra rich, and you see them as successful masculine ideas or image. But locally, there are also hegemonic masculinity ideas, right? That shaped local masculinity projects. For these men, privileged by their highly ranked Singaporean citizenship, their Chinese ethnicity, because Chinese is the ethnic majority in Singapore. Therefore, you have unearned racial privilege. Their male gender identity, so they're privileged by patriarchy, and also heterosexual, right? Heterosexuality, so they have, you know, they're privileged by their sexuality. So these low-income Singaporean men are in fact in great demand in the regional marriage market. So for them, getting a wife and set up a family is a very integral part of their masculinity project, and their hope to restore their masculine pride, because in their own country, they are being disenfranchised. They feel disenfranchised because they're low income, they haven't gotten married yet, or some of them are divorced, they are old, and they think that if I get a young wife and I restore my masculine pride by being the benevolent patriarch, I'm going there to, you know, rescue these poor women, then I may have some hope in building up a successful masculinity project, right? So that to them is the picture of successful masculinity, and it's inspired by local dominant masculinity ideas. Singaporean post-colonial masculinities not only embody British colonial masculine ideas, we were formerly a British colony, but at the same time has also exceeded colonial constructions and experienced post-colonial transformation. Right, so under the influence of the global city-state economic success story as one of the 4 tiger economies in Asia, and combined with Confucianism, Buddhism, Christianity, Taoism, Singaporean society develops their own particular brand of hegemonic masculinity. So Confucian ideas especially shape the image of a successful Singaporean man. So the image of a Singaporean Chinese man who occupies a powerful, high-paying political and government position, works very hard for the citizens he set out to serve, and in the private sphere, maintain the headship of the household, the head of the household, as a heterosexual, legally married patriarch, and a reliable economic provider, a faithful husband to his wife, a devoted father to his children, and a filial son to his elderly parents, all become dominant in our local imagination of what it means to be a successful man. So this group of low-income divorced men really are into this masculinity project. So some people may ask, why is it that they will have to go to the regional market to look for a wife? Why is it that even when they're divorced 2-3 times and they're in their 50s, 60s, they still want to have a wife? Because of what I have discussed in my book about the prominence of their masculinity project. So in this case, their intimacy practices are instrumental, right? Instrumental in building their masculinity project. So they use money. Money is a key factor here. They use money, right, to hope to have to exchange for intimate labor, right? To have a wife, to have somebody to produce their offspring, to be able to look after them, to take care of their elderly parents. And so, therefore, the intimacy practices that they construct using money, right, is instrumental to their masculinity project. And therefore, I conceptualize it as instrumental intimacies, right? And so it is not to say that who is good or who is bad, and that's not the job of a scholar, right, of a sociologist, but it's really to make sense of why is it this whole big group from Hong Kong, from South Korea, from Japan, even now China, Singapore, Western Europe, as well as Northern America. Why is it that they are all going to the international marriage market to look for a foreign wife? And so this is not unique to Singapore, but it's really a global phenomenon. So it's really at their bet at reclaiming some form of respect, some form of recognition and power, right? Especially when they feel disenfranchised, right, in their own home society and at home as well. So they engage in this instrumental intimacy, and I argue that their transnational intimacy arrangement and practices are therefore very important for us to look at even after divorce, right? They are really instrumental in contributing to their masculinity project. So every society will have certain ideas of what it means to be a successful man. So it might be interesting to also, I'm sure in South Korean society, a lot of scholars have also theorized about this. So one particular case, which is Teck An, right, that just to share with you this story about Teck An. So when divorce takes place, some of these men, they feel that, or rather within the marriage, because as I mentioned, their starting point is to restore their masculine pride. So they expect to do that during the whole marriage. So when they feel that their foreign wife does not help them restore their position as the benevolent patriarch or as the head of the household, that's when they feel shortchanged, right? So as you see in the cases of a child, in the case of child, that when her spouse, her husband, feel that she's not producing the reproductive labor that she is expected to, right, at the price, right? So she didn't come back early to look after the children. So when they feel that their foreign wife did not fulfill their criteria or expectations, that's when they feel shortchanged. They feel that I put in, the money and the time to look for a foreign wife, and the foreign wife did not deliver. How can that be? So in this case for Teck An, his former Thai wife started to call him nonstop and to check on his movements, right? And then he feel that insulted his masculine pride. How can men endure this? Men cannot stand this kind of treatment. Men cannot be questioned by their women, right? So he felt very controlled. He felt that his masculine pride was affected. And so then he decided to end the marriage. And when I asked her to go back to her country, she cried, she do not want, but there's no use, nothing else she can do. I make up my mind, right? I did not tell the children their mother was leaving. Their mother did not say goodbye to them because he bought her an air ticket and sent her to the airport when their children are still in school, right? So they didn't even know that their mother is leaving, and she didn't get to say goodbye to the children. So she cried over losing her kids and be separated from them. And the day when she left, they were in school, she was sad, but I was not sad. So this is not also a case to say that, oh, Teck An is an evil man, right? But then you could appreciate the motivation behind this action, that is all centering around masculinity project, that if my masculine pride, my masculine project is deemed to fail, I can't allow that, right? I need to be able to have control over it. But it is also not a straightforward villain versus victim narrative. It's not a straightforward binary narrative, because what happened is that when Teck An, when his wife went back to Thailand, he started to feel really confused, very guilty, and when he started to see that his children are not being well taken care of, he felt a great sense of regrets. So we would expect him to, cut off all ties and have nothing to do with his ex-wife, but that didn't happen. He started to keep regular contact with his ex-wife. He started to make long-distance phone calls to keep her updated and provide, regular updates on their children's well-being. And even during the initial years, he would organize annual trips to bring his children back to her country, and for them to spend the whole 1 month school holidays. So he would bring them to a village and escort them to the village, and then he will go back to Singapore. And then at the end of the school holiday, he will go back to the village and pick up the children again. So he would do these things on his own, right? On his own account. So you expect it to be really clear-cut, but it's not clear-cut, right? It's not so straightforward. So when I asked him, why do you do these things? Why do you, continue to do that? And what is even more surprising is that he continued to provide money to his ex-wife. when he doesn't have to, right? That because he has full custody of the children, he doesn't have to pay alimony, he doesn't have to pay child custody, but he will continue to remit money every month, right? So when I asked him, he said, I don't know, it's just automatic. So as a sociologist, what is interesting to really analyze this is that he wanted to continue to be the breadwinner again. He wanted to resume his masculinity project. He wanted to be that benevolent savior patriarch again, because when I asked him further, he also said that, oh, she's such a poor thing, you know, if I don't give him money, they have no food to eat, and I must continue to help them, even though they are divorced, right? So restarting his Confucian masculinity project is very important here in his narrative, because he wants to be that superior man again. He wants to be that good man again. And that is something that's really important in the Confucian masculinity idea, right? So he also reminded me that he even sent money to his ex-wife, so that his ex-wife and her family could have money to eat and could build a house. Right. So what is interesting here is that by being able to be the economic provider for his ex-wife and her family, he managed to restore his sense of masculine pride and felt good for himself, even though he didn't have to, even though that he was already divorced. So that is interesting in terms of looking at their transnational divorce biographies, where you see how intimacy is instrumental, right, in building up the masculinity project. Now, there's another group of people that I look at. So I think that when we think about intersectionality, it is not important. It's not sufficient to only think about inequalities, but it's also really important to look at the intersection of privileges. Right. So often when we think about intersectional framework, or we think about intersectionality, we only look at those who have been disenfranchised. It's important, but I think that it is also important to scrutinize privileges. So using intersectional feminist lens to make sense of transnational divorce, I argue that it is not sufficient and not complete to only talk about oppressions, but it is also really important to discuss how some of my respondents that I spoke with benefited from multiple forms of privileges and managed to have the resources to negate the undesirable implications of divorce, and they are able to minimize the loss incurred due to the divorce. And in addition, they could also restore their lives to normalcy. They could pick up and have their better resource in navigating their post-divorce lives, and they could achieve stability a lot quicker. So enabled by a combination of privileges derived from citizenship, right, location of residence, class, language, education background, ethnicity, and sexuality, some respondents could tap on supportive resources to engage the service of, say, well-known legal companies who specialize in transnational divorce. And that's a huge thing, right? Because being able to have access to specialized legal resources are important. They are also able to work out alternative accommodation. They're able to raise children single-handedly without having to worry about child support payments. They could even innovate different living apart together intimacy practices. Now, when we think about living apart together families, this has been widely conceptualized as couples who are still together, right? So if you look at the migration scholarship, people talk about living apart together families as those who are separated because of migration, because of work normally, right? So one party is in one country, another party is in another country or in another state, and they are living apart, but they're together. Now, I argue that divorced families could be seen as LTAT families. They could be seen as living apart together because we sometimes don't think that divorced families are still together, but in many cases, they are still very much together because especially if children are involved. Right? When children are involved, the couples and the children always find themselves having to maintain some form of togetherness. So they could be living apart in different households. And in this case, in many of my cases, they're living apart in different countries, right? Because of transnational divorce. But they somehow still have to work out living apart together family intimacies for the sake of the children, or even for the sake of some family relationships that are really good. For example, some of the divorce respondents I spoke with, they still keep really good relationship with their former in-laws because of the closeness that they developed during the marriage, and then they're not just going to discard their relationship, right? So in this case, it's considered LAT intimacy as well. So for this group of people, privilege really come into the picture, because if you live in an affluent country, right, where you have access to virtual communication infrastructures and technologies, right, it is readily available. For example, now we can Zoom, right? We are all in privileged countries where we could access internet easily. We each have our own laptop. These are all privileges, right? But then some of the people that I spoke with in my study, it's not something that they have, right? So some of the families I spoke with, they can't maintain contact with their families in another country because they don't have access to internet. Internet is expensive, or that they have to buy the data that's expensive as well, or they don't have money to that they can afford a computer or their own smartphone, or that the people that they are trying to get in touch with could be in a remote region, in a village, for example, where there's no access, right, to this infrastructure. So it is important for us to remember that if you have the economic resources, right, due to your class, your nationality, your race and gender privileges, you then have the ability to innovate, right, living apart together intimacies. And that was seen in the case of my respondents, right? They're privileged by an intersection of their country, their nationality, the place they stay, and the class and race as well. So in this particular case, I have this respondent. Her name is Miranda, Singaporean Chinese. So you can see already ethnic majority privilege, Singaporean as a nationality privilege, highly educated, so class, middle class. She owns her own home, and she's a divorced mother of 3. So when she went through the divorce, she moved out of United States back to Singapore, but because of a class background and because being back in their own country where you have the nationality citizenship privilege, where you know how to navigate the local system, she managed to engage the service of a very expensive law firm who really know how to do transnational divorce, because transnational divorce is a different ball game altogether. It's very complicating with international laws, you know. So, but she managed to find somebody who is really good at it, and as a result, she could bring her children back to Singapore without get into the trouble with the International Convention on Child Abduction, because both countries, US and Singapore, are signatories of the Hague Convention, international abduction. So her ex-husband could easily summon, could easily get, file a lawsuit against her and to get the countries to return the 3 children. But because she could engage a very good law firm, she managed to do that. And because later with her privileges, she also managed to create a weekend visit, as if it's an actual physical weekend visit. So in this case, it's that every Saturday, she will leave the house and do her own thing and get her me day. She'll go to the spa, she'll go to the gym, she'll meet her friends for drinks. Then on the actual day, her 3 children will log on to this video game platform and play video games with their father the whole day, right? So this is an example of privilege where you can afford, right, the internet access for the whole day. You can afford the video game subscription, which is not cheap. But you can then buy yourself some freedom. And after that, they even organize family trips where they decide on a country that both parties will meet, right? So she will bring the 3 kids, and ex-husband will meet them in a country, say, for example, Netherlands, right? And then they meet there, and then they could the kids will spend time with the father and have their trip, and she will get her own trip. So these are all a reflection of privileges, right? An example of privileged intimacies that allow allow some transnational divorce families to be able to craft out a more bearable, a more effective transnational divorce biographies. So we can see that very clearly in terms of class, right? And the 4th group of people that I spoke with are these groups of citizens, mothers who are based overseas, and they just decided not to come back. And I borrow Gloria Anzaldúa, who is a Chicana Mexican feminist that I like very much. And in her book, I use this conceptualization of qualiqueer state, right? So this is qualiqueer, which is, you can read out about it. That's the name of the goddess. I have no time to look at it here, but it is basically a and Sandra used it to describe the idea of purgatory, right? That you're neither here nor there, and that you can embody life and death together, right? That is, it's not so straightforward that you're either dead or alive, but you can have life in death and death in life, and that is the whole idea of what qualique state is. And I thought that was a really appropriate conceptualization to describe, to theorize the entanglements, right, that this group of divorcees have with their home country, with their children, with their parents. So I talk about the weaving of entangled intimacies between overseas-based Singaporean divorcees and their home country and families back home. So I look at two groups. One group is that the divorcees who have ended their transnational marriage and moved overseas after the divorce. Another group is the marriage migrants who have moved to another country because of their marriage and they remain there and they didn't return, right? So, and there are all different circumstances why they are stuck overseas. But what is significant about this is that I discuss the entangled intimacies in a way that they look at they're neither here nor there. And it's constructed around conflicted feelings towards their home country, and also construction of intimacy practices in anticipation of very messy entanglements with their former spouse, and also looking at how the entangled intimacy practices are constructed based on their torn feelings between homesickness, filial obligations, and parental responsibilities. So I know I'm coming to the end of my time, and therefore I just want to quickly give you an example of this group of people I spoke with. And one of the example is Anaya, a Singaporean Indian divorced mother of 3. She now lives in the US when I interviewed her for the project. Although she has been living away from her home country for many, many years, she could never really turn her back completely from the land she was born and bred in. Because after all, Singapore was home to her children. Her children has remained in Singapore, has not come with her for the past decades. Now she's in her 50s and she lives a very highly precarious, unstable existence. She lives in the caravan park, and she has been struggling with long-term homelessness and poverty. Naturally, we think that why don't you go back to your own country where you can enjoy citizenship privileges and your 3 children who are already adults could look after you, right? But she decided not to. She decided not to take advantage of her citizenship rights and benefits. She wanted to stay on only because that she left for a very clear reason, that she felt that the restrictive cultural expectation on her being married was too strong, and when she got a divorce, she received a lot of harassment from her own family, a lot of pressure from her own family, that she decided to stay away. And so after staying away, it has been so long. And now her Singaporean passport has also expired. So she faced complication in trying to renew it. She knows that it's hard for her to visit Singapore in any near future, but then the thought of her home country is still really, really strong because her 3 children are still back in Singapore. So this kind of qualique state of liminality, ambiguity, and contradiction is something that I saw really, really clear in this last group of overseas-based divorced mothers, and how they then have to construct entangled intimacies around each of their circumstances that they are located in. So these are the 4 groups of transnational divorce, transnational divorce families that I spoke with. Now, the finished product of the book is really an assemblage of human stories relating to movements, shift, connections, hardships, and metamorphoses. Now, it speaks of everyday life. It validates a variety of human lives, and it showcases diverse life possibilities. And we can see that they are located at the intersection of global, transnational, national, and local systems of domination and oppression. Divorcees all work out their transnational divorce intimacies depending on their positions and encounters with privileges and inequalities. So I hope that the book has served as a strategic feminist intervention to really blow flames, which is to expose the deep-rooted, widespread and systemic inequalities and injustices. And in the epilogue of the book, which is the last part of my book, the conclusion, I launched my own strand of feminism, and I call it Fire Dragon Feminism. It's my attempt to decolonize feminism. It's my attempt to develop place-based feminist tools of methodology, not just for research and teaching activism, but also for the navigation of everyday life in the face of neoliberal demands, racial capitalism, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. And it also draws on my own ethnic, cultural, intellectual, and feminist upbringing and training, and it reflects my epistemological and ontological positions. Now, I have no time to speak more about Fire Dragon Feminism, but that was the ending, because you write a book and you go through a project and you expose so much horrible things, inequalities and injustices, and then what, right? So it was also a journey for myself that I need some form of tools, some form of methodology, some manifesto to help me move on as I continue to do the work. And that's how I launched Fire Dragon Feminism. And now I'm still on the mission of collecting superpowers to fill up my Fire Dragon Feminist arsenal as I continue this work of exposing inequalities and do this work of activism to rebuild communities and to reimagine a different kind of future. So I'm happy to answer more questions around Fire Dragon Feminism, since I don't have an opportunity to speak more about it, but I'm looking forward to the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your lecture. And we're going to start the discussion now. And I received a question from Sang-Mi Lee, which is a student in our department. And she wants to ask, as you mentioned in your presentation, marriage migrant women's divorce is not just personal matters. Many structural factors and global economic system is affecting it. And in the case of Singapore men, and also the ideas of masculinity are pushing men to find their marriage partners from abroad. And she was wondering that those marriages become like there is a inequality in it because of the economic aspect that implies the international marriage itself. So, but she believes that once the marriage is done, it should be perceived, and it should maintain an equal family relationship between the partners. So what do you think is necessary to improve that and to help those international couples to obtain that equality that is required in the marriage in order to make it successful?
Yeah, so I get that questions, and I also get where it's coming from. So I explained at the beginning of my lecture, right, that I can't provide marriage counseling or marriage advice, how couples should work out their relationship in order to have a more successful marriage and to prevent divorce. In the first place, I do not think that divorce is a bad thing. I think that it is actually a liberal outcome for many people who are suffering abuse and suffering the constriction of heteronormativity, the pressure of being stuck in the institution of marriage and reproduction that can be really, really constrictive. So that is my position, right? It is not a good or bad thing when it comes to divorce. And I think as a feminist sociologist, I am not here to give advice on how to work out the relationship or how couples should also work on the relationship in order to make it successful. But I think that it is very important for policymakers, for practitioners, for educators to know why is it that this phenomenon exists. Why is it that we are seeing the question that we should be asking are questions that involve global inequalities? Why is it that some countries are sending out this mass number of poor women to supply reproductive labor? right, for wealthier countries? That's the bigger question. Why is it that some countries get to reap the benefits from globalization, economic globalization, while some countries continue to supply resources, labor, and continue to be disenfranchised and disadvantaged by economic globalization? Why is it they remain at the bottom? From colonialism through now to a neoliberal structure, why is it they continue to be there? And therefore the questions around that, right, will then inform why is it that we're seeing this marriage trend between low income men from wealthy countries and poor women from less wealthy countries, right? And also and if we understand that, then we will then understand that the starting point of the marriage is already transactional. The starting point of the marriage is that it is already on unequal grounds, where the one who is paying will have greater bargaining power, right? And because of the unequal power dynamics, right, it is only inevitable. It is almost predictable that there will be issues within the marriage where you will see that one is being oppressed and how much you can tolerate. And sometimes the oppression and the abuse can be so unbearable that the low-income marriage migrant women decide to leave, right? It's not that there are no cases where things will work out well, right? That it happens that there are some really good citizen men who decide to, not take advantage of the situation, become a very caring man, blah, 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 right? These things can happen, but we're not individualizing each stories, but we're rather looking at the broader structures, right, of how this global structure of inequalities shape decisions at the marriage and divorce level, and also shape the kind of practices and outcomes at the individual level, and how it affects the children involved and how it affects families. So that is what the motivation of my research is about, rather than to prescribe, advice on how marriages can be worked out better to prevent a divorce, and that's never the motivation of my research. Thank you for the question.
Is well answered, Jamie. So we will move for other questions. Is there anybody that has any other question? Also, you can use the chat-in space if you feel more comfortable instead of speaking out loud, or you can just to speak out loud. It's fine. If not anybody, then I can ask some question too.
Yeah, I think to follow up on Jiangmi's question is then what do we do now that we know that this happened, right? I think a lot of things can be done where if the receiving countries, with their immigration regime, they know that that it is on very unequal path to begin with. So when divorce take place, instead of thinking that let me just chuck you, discard you, and dispose you because you're not of use to us anymore, because you're not in a marriage anymore, then we don't have to care about you. I think that wealthy countries that receive these migrants are responsible for the inequalities to begin with, and then they are responsible also for treating the migrants well. When you receive them, they come to supply reproductive labor. When they are out of the marriage, you don't just chuck them as if they are rag dolls, like they are useless and we decide to throw them out, especially when they have children, citizenship children, and they are forcibly being separated, right? Or that they feel that they have lived in the home country, in their host country for 10, 20 years, it's already their home. They have contributed so much to the economy of the host country. And it is only right to treat them well and give them a pathway if they want to stay, to give them a pathway to let them stay and have access to work. And I think that is the responsibility of wealthy countries, because we are responsible for the plight in the first place. We're responsible for the inequalities because we've benefited so much from economic globalization at their expense. Yeah, so that's to answer the question. Thank you.
We have another comment on the chatting room from one of the research professors in our department. And thank you for your lecture. The concept divorce biography gives me an idea on how to approach the life experience of divorce life from a feminist perspective. To make the concept more clear to me, could you explain in more detail about how the time biography works in the notion of divorce life? In this lecture, I think you have sought for different categories of lived experience of divorce life among 4 different group of people rather than in relation to their lifetime.
Yeah, thank you. That's really important. Thank you for the question. It's a really, really good question. In the first book, when I conceptualized divorce biography, I talk about it in terms of time, in terms of temporality, in terms of their life course, because I wanted to conceptualize divorce as not just a once-off legal event that, I sign the papers, that's it, it's all over. But rather, it is really a biographical process, right? It's a life course where after, before divorce, there are things that they have to do, and then during divorce and after divorce, and even after divorce, it's still a biographical process. They don't just stop being divorced overnight, or they don't just work out everything when they sign. In fact, they will go through an undulating path. It is non-linear, and I discussed that at length in 2 books, in fact, to show how that they have gone through different aspects of their life course depending on the situations, right? So they could go through seasons of productivity where they feel that they can get a rebirth, they get recharged, they find a new meaning of life, they get a new job, they upgrade themselves, and they get a new home, they feel a great sense of recovery and ownership. But it doesn't mean it stay that way throughout. It could be that they go through they could go down again when, for example, their children are growing up and they are at the teenage time where they are started questioning about the parental divorce and why. So then it can pose different kind of challenges, but it's still related to the divorce, right? So I argue in 2 books is that that divorce has to be seen as a biographical event, the process where you go through different kind of shifting events, shifting processes. You are at the intersection, right, of events, processes, and structures that shift all the time because the circumstances can change. So therefore, you can also shift between privileges and inequalities, right? It's not stagnant, right? It's always moving. And that's why I think that framework is a more useful framework for me to make sense of divorce, rather than to see that it is a one-off legal event. Or when you look at some self-help literature, they tell you that, first stage you will be angry, then the next stage you will be sad, and the next stage you will go to unforgiveness, which I totally object to that kind of prescription of how divorce recovery looks like. So in this lecture, I didn't get a chance to really discuss at length how they go through their life process. But in the second book, with these 4 groups of divorcees that I spoke about, you will see that I talk about their life process at greater length, where I look at how they got into the transnational marriage in the first place, what their motivations, and then what happened during the marriage, and then when they decide to get a divorce, what happened after the divorce, and until the point that I met them for interview. And some of them kept in touch with me and gave me updates of what happened. So it's really a biographical process that is not straightforward. I hope I answered your question, Professor.
Also, Alexandra, I have a question also. Do you have a plan to do research in other countries to compare the cases and do a global research on this topic she's curious about?
I think that even though it is set in Singapore, it is and what is really different is probably the national context of migration regime, a specific migration regime, and specific family policies. But you will see that across countries, it's quite similar in terms of how they subscribe to neoliberal principles. right? Because we are all caught up in this global neoliberal economy. So if you look at the wealthy countries, how they have been managing migrant bodies, how they have been stopping people to come across the border, where you see large refugee camps, who couldn't cross over, where you see what Trump did was he wanted to build a wall, right? These kind of things may be specific in different circumstances, but the principle is the same, right? How bodies are being treated, how they're being disposed, expelled, being treated with violence. I think that whichever context, I could be doing it in South Korea. Yeah, there will be specific policies that are different, specific circumstances and different specific historical contexts that could be different. But currently, what is happening in terms of the global context and in terms of how it affects transnational divorce, they tell a global story. It's quite a similar picture across the globe. So whether I will compare cases, I'm not sure whether it will really extend the conceptualization unless I am thinking of transnational divorce differently. I have also done some research here in Australia where I spoke with quite a large number of divorce people here, including transnational divorce people. So I'm thinking of whether to continue that, or I'm also now looking at other. I've been working on divorce since my PhD, so I've typed this word at least 1 billion times. I'm just a bit sick of me talking about divorce. So I'm interested to move towards a new research project on queer migrants, so LGBTQI people who have migrated to other countries, and looking at the issues of sexualities and things like that. So that is my new project. Thank you so much for the question and the interest.
There are some other questions. I guess people is very curious about your project. I have some questions too, and I don't sure if I'm gonna have time to ask them. Okay, one of the questions is, I think you partly answer it, but it's from Professor Kim Kyung-hak. It's the head of our department. And while your current study deals with divorce cases between couples from different nationalities and cultural backgrounds, I wonder if you have ever studied divorce cases between Singaporean immigrant couples living in Australia.
I have spoken with not just Singaporean migrant couples living in Australia, but also migrant couples from other countries, including Turkey. So I didn't just restrict to Singapore, but I talked to Malaysians, Indonesians, Turkey, Ukraine. I still talk to quite a large number of migrant couples, Indian and Chinese as well, migrant couples who have moved to Australia, and to understand their circumstances and experiences. So that's I have spoken to a wide variety of people here in Australia.
And also Rapani, Polan Rapani is asking a question. Do functionalism, symbolic interactionism, and feminism are three of the major paradigms that have different level on perspective of the topic of divorce. Do you think divorce is the legal dissolution of a marriage, but the court or other component body? Maybe Rapani can explain better this question.
So I'm a bit confused about the question. If you can clarify it for me, I would really appreciate that.
Could you speak up, Rapani, and clarify the question?
Thank you, Professor, for your nice lecture. So I just wanna curious about do you think the divorce is the legal dissolution? For example, divorce means the separation of the body, but if the body will be separated from their body, relation would be separated by but do you think it is the legally separated from the like any code of conduct or something like that?
I think I know what you're saying. Well, so for my research for both projects, right? The first project, which is, or the first book, right? Look at the divorce couples in the local couples, so they're not transnational divorce couples. And then the second book, look at the transnational couples. In both projects, I only focus on couples who have legally dissolved their marriage. So I didn't interview separated, like you mentioned, physically separated, but they could still be legally married. I didn't focus on that. I wanted it to be very clear in my approach, which is to focus on the legally dissolved couples, so that I could then, really understand how the legal dissolution had impact their post-divorce lives, right? So in terms of child custody, in terms of financial arrangement, in terms of property settlement, all these things needs to be settled if it's brought in the court, right? So I wanted to know how the legal dissolution really affect their post-divorce lives, and therefore I didn't focus on the separated couples, because I feel that that's not my scope of study, and somehow I think that they haven't really gone through some of the legal aspects. They may not have gone through some of the legal aspects. So I just wanted to really narrow my scope and define my sample more clearly. Thank you for the question.
And well, if there is any other question, I would like to ask some questions. And one is, well, it's two of them are general on how your position as a researcher while you were doing this research. So first is, how did it affect your positionality as an insider, as you explain in the book, and how did it affected your research, especially in relation to the interviews? If you have some problems detaching yourself from the topic to look at it from an objective point of view. That's one question.
Thank you, Ines, Miranda. I don't see researchers necessarily as having to be objective beings that are detached from the research. Now, for a long time, this positivist perspective was very popular, right? That as a researcher, you should be detached, you should be completely objective, and you should come out with all kinds of research procedures to ensure that you as a human being doesn't exist. When you enter the field site, you're supposed to be this detached, objective person. But there have also been a lot of scholarship that critique that kind of approach, because it's not possible for human beings to enter the field site without any positionality, or without being able to bring with you affects, emotions, your history, your whole entire being into the field site, and think that you're just a machine or a robot. So I no longer subscribe to such a position where I think that researchers foolproof objectives beings that do nothing. But having said that, I think that it's of course very important as researchers, especially for me as a feminist sociologist, to clarify my positionality, right? So I enter the field site. Who am I? What is my epistemological position? How do I know what I know, right? Where do I derive my knowledge? And my ontological position, what is my my historical, cultural, and ethnic, national, background, like who am I as a person, my class background, right? So I think that entering the field site, it's also important for me to check my own privileges, to recognize my own privileges, and to understand the unequal power dynamics. So no matter how objective you are, right, what I really have a problem with is that when you claim that you're objective, does that mean it doesn't affect your power dynamics between the researcher and the research? Of course it does, right? So hiding behind objectivity doesn't disrupt the power unequal power dynamics. So I think then it is important to be truthful about it, to be reflective, to be reflexive, and to be aware of the effect that will take place in the field side. That I recognize that I am privileged. The fact that I'm an academic researcher, right? That I have the social capital, the cultural capital to begin with. So the research subject will always think, oh, you are this academic researcher, so you are more powerful. So that is something to be already to be aware of, right? And therefore it is very important to reflect on the privileges, reflect on what is shaping the power dynamics, and to talk about it. You can't erase it, but then to be cognizant of how that then might affect the interaction, and how then you can try to level things up. How can then you think about ways to create more equal relations, at the field side. And how do you then give agency and autonomy to the research subjects to say what they want to say? So I think that is from my perspective, and to constantly thinking and learning, studying decolonial feminist methodology, which is to then disrupt that unequal power relations, and to also think about how that some of the methods that we learn could be very wide, could be very could actually reinforce the power of the researcher. So how can I make sure that I can de-white it, decolonize it, and make sure that it is less harmful for the research subject. So when they give you all your stories into the field site, what can you give back to them, right? So that they don't leave the field site feeling so hollow, giving you all the intimate details and telling you all the horrible things that happen to them, and then you leave them leaving the field site so vulnerable and feeling hollow out. What do they get in return, right? So how can this process benefit the research as well? So this is really important to consider. So to me, that is a more important consideration than to think that I need to be objective all the time. Now, and I think giving the autonomy, the space for my research subjects to share their stories, right? Then I'm trying to already give them power. So as an insider, because I'm also a divorced person, I will be able to see that I'm able to create the empathy, and think that when you do qualitative in-depth interviews, especially with vulnerable subjects and topics that are so sensitive, the human factor is important. I think that not having that human exchange of empathy is in fact, I don't think something that I can do as a human being entering the field site. But having said that, I let them have the space to share their stories, and depending on the situation, I sometimes end the whole interview after they feel hollow out. I get prompted by my own effective response by sharing my own stories, and then there's this connection of human lives, and to me, that is something that's important. And of course, I clarify very clearly in my methodology and explain why I do what I do, and to reflect on the kind of feminist ethical principles that I bring to the field site, and constantly trying to see how I can learn to be better at the field site.
Okay, I think we don't have much time for questions, so
yes.
I think it was a pleasure to have you in the lecture, and maybe we can all put the camera on and take a last picture all together. Will be nice. Those who have the camera there. Thank you very much for your cooperation. And I guess no other camera left, so I will take a screenshot of our lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your questions. And feel free to contact me. Ines has my email address. Feel free to contact me if you have more questions, and if you'd like to, exchange ideas on this topic, I'll be more than happy to be in touch with you. Thank you
very much. Thank you very much.